It's so important to talk about LGBT history and to develop a knowledge of LGBT lives across time, as it encourages an understanding of differences of experience within identity, as well as celebrating our achievements and learning from society's mistakes which have cost so many so dearly. Metro Charity are a leading equality and diversity charity who provide health, community and youth services with regards to sexuality, gender, equality, diversity and identity. We have 5 domains: sexual and reproductive health, community, mental health and well-being, youth and HIV. In our sexual and reproductive health domain, we offer free condoms, free chlamydia and gonorrhea home testing kits for young people and advice and support. In our community domain, we offer support in the form of drop-in groups. In our mental health and wellbeing domain, we offer those drop-ins as well as counselling. We have several youth groups in the south of London as well as Medway, and we also have support for people living with and affected by HIV. Today's learning outcomes are identifying what the letters LGBTQ+ represent, developing an awareness of LGBTQ+ people's lives and their history, and identifying ways to better support LGBTQ+ people. Which brings us to our first exercise. In front of you, you should have a worksheet. For exercise 1, I want you to name as many of these letters and what they stand for as you can. Please pause the video here. So some of you might have got these, some of you might have got some identities outside of those letters. We have here L standing for lesbian, G standing for gay, B standing for bi or bisexual, T which stands for trans or transgender, Q which stands for questioning, we have the other Q which stands for queer, I stands for intersex, A stands for asexual, and P stands for pansexual. The plus stands for anything that is an identity that is outside of heterosexual or cisgender. Before we move on, here are some key words and phrases and what they mean. Cisgender or cis is a word to mean somebody who identifies with what they were assigned at birth. Fun fact, in Greek, cis means to stay in the same place. When we say assigned at birth, we're talking about the gender that often society assigns to somebody on the basis of the genitals that they're born with. This is very often shown through a birth certificate that a doctor will either write M or F on, which stands for male or female. Heterosexual is a word that is often used instead of the word straight, and it means somebody who is attracted to the opposite sex. So people who identify as men and are attracted to women are heterosexual, and people who identify as women and are attracted to men are also heterosexual. Non-binary has 2 elements to it, the word non and the word binary. So by binary, we mean that somebody can be one of 2 options. And when somebody is non-binary, that means that they don't agree with having to describe themselves as one of those 2 options, either man or woman. So a non-binary person might identify with both aspects of being a man or a woman, or neither, and just identifies outside of those very distinct categories. Coming out is a phrase that we use to say that somebody is telling other people about their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, it's not something that straight people or cisgender people really have to do because their identities aren't marginalised. However, those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans or anything else that isn't straight or cis have to come out quite often. When somebody is outed, that's when other people are told about their identity without their consent. Often people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans are outed to other people, meaning that they don't have that sense of secrecy about their identity and they don't have a choice about who does and doesn't know about their authentic selves. Now we're going to show you a range of different flags representing the identities that we just talked about. We have here lesbian, which is a woman who has a romantic and or sexual orientation towards women, and some non-binary people may also identify with this term. We've also got the flag for gay men. Being gay means a man who has a romantic and or sexual orientation towards men. It's a generic term for lesbian and gay sexuality, and some women define themselves as gay rather than lesbian, and some non-binary people may also identify this way. Bi is an umbrella term to describe a romantic and or sexual orientation towards more than one gender. Bi people may describe themselves using one or more terms, including bisexual, pan, queer, and some other non-monosexual and non-monoromantic identities. Trans is an umbrella term which means somebody who doesn't identify with the gender that was assigned to them at birth, or the gender that society associates with their body. Some people who are trans experience gender dysphoria, although not all trans people experience this. An important thing to take into account is that somebody who's trans may start using different pronouns or a different name. This is no different to anyone else changing their name, and it's important to remember that you might make mistakes. But the best thing to do is, if you do make a mistake, to correct yourself and move on, and don't deny responsibility for your actions. The word queer is often used as an umbrella term to reject specific labels of romantic orientation, sexual orientation, or gender identity. It's a way of rejecting perceived norms of the LGBT community, and can be used to just say that you feel differently to just heterosexual or cisgender. We also have the word intersex, which is also an umbrella term for somebody whose body doesn't necessarily meet those criteria of just male or female. Now, there are over 27 known types of intersex, and it's estimated that 1 in 1,000 people are intersex. And there is now a campaign for the recognition of something called intersex genital mutilation, which is where people's genitals and body is changed to meet the strict criteria of just male or female. Asexual, commonly referred to as ace, means that somebody experiences little or no sexual attraction. Asexual people often still feel romantic attraction and can have just as fulfilling relationships as non-asexual people. Pansexual can be the romantic or sexual attraction towards others, which is not limited by sex or gender. So people who are pansexual don't necessarily care what gender somebody is. To put this into perspective, we have here the cisgender and the transgender umbrellas. So under cisgender, we have cis women and cis men, and this simply means people who identify with what they were assigned at birth. Under the trans umbrella, we have trans women and trans men, as well as non-binary identities. A non-binary identity means that somebody does not identify with strictly just being a man or a woman. Some words for this are genderqueer, gender fluid, bigender, and agender. I hope you've been inspired by all the flags and what identities they represent, as we will be going to exercise 2 now. In this exercise, we ask you to draw your own flag and explain the identity that you're trying to represent and why that's important to you. You may pause the video here. In this next exercise, we'll be looking at an LGBTQ history timeline. Please make a note of 2 or 3 people or events that you find interesting, and we'll come back to that in a second. This is a timeline of key lesbian, gay, bisexual people and events. Sappho, who was a Greek poet who lived from 630 to 570 BC, wrote poems to female lovers and is one of the first literary lesbians of our time. Emperor Ai of Han is an example that people in the monarchy in ancient China were also lesbian, gay and bisexual, as he had male lovers and was living from 27 BC to 1 BC. We also have Anne Lister, a landowner in the 1800s who is now famous for her diary entries written in a secret code that documented her romantic relationships with women. Oscar Wilde lived from 1854 to 1900 and was an Irish poet and playwright who wrote the chilling novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. Ma Rainey, who was born in 1886 and died in 1939, is described as the mother of the blues. Her voice was very distinctive and added a certain je ne sais quoi to blues music at the time. Marion Barbara Jo Corstez was a boat racer living from 1900 to 1993. Alan Turing, a mathematician and computer scientist who worked to break the codes of enemy communications in World War II. Billie Holiday, who lived from 1915 to 1959, rose to fame in the 30s with a unique singing style and songwriting skills, as well as views on inequality and justice. Her version of Strange Fruit is often described as one of the most compelling and moving songs of its time. Wahid Ali, also known as Lord Ali, member of the House of Lords, was the youngest and first openly gay peer in Parliament. Phil Akua Opoku Gima, who is the founder of UK Black Pride, an event which takes into account those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans, as well as being people of colour. The following is a recent history and timeline of events that have affected and represented people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans. In 1967, the Sexual Offences Act meant that homosexual acts between two men over the age of 21 were decriminalised. In 1969, there was the Stonewall Uprising in New York. There are many theories as to how the Stonewall Uprising started and who it implicated. What is certain is that the New York police carried out a raid on the Stonewall Inn in the early hours of June 28, 1969. The clientele of the Stonewall Inn were mostly gay men, lesbian and trans people. Homosexuality at the time was illegal in 49 states, and it was on this day that the patrons of the Stonewall Inn resisted the arrest. Eventually, the crowd resisting the arrest grew to its thousands, and the battle against the police continued on and off for 5 nights. This is a key moment in the history of the LGBTQ+ civil rights movement. 1972, there was the first gay pride in London. In 1974, the BBC drama Girl, featuring Alison Steadman, depicted the first lesbian kiss on British television. The director Peter Gill said it was just a love story and didn't really make a big fuss about the fact that it was a story about 2 women. 1983, Peter Tatchell lost the Bermondsey by-election and went on to campaign for human rights in a role outside of being an MP. 1984, Metro Charity, formerly known as the Greenwich Lesbian and Gay Centre, was established and started work tackling the inequalities that are faced by the LGBT community, and continues to embrace difference and celebrate diversity. In 1984 to 1985, miners were on strike because the mines were being closed down. Lesbians and gays rallied together to support the miners and met every week at Gays the Word bookshop, which still stands today. They supported the miners by raising funds and by protesting and activism. 1988 saw the implementation of Section 28, which was anti-gay legislation that said a local authority shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, and also said that a local authority shall not promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. This legislation was in place until 2003 and contributed to a lot of fear around teaching about people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans in schools. In 1989, we saw our first gay kiss on EastEnders. 1992, the World Health Organization declassified homosexuality as a psychological or behavioral disorder. Also in 1992, the age of consent for same-sex relationships became equal with heterosexual relationships. Previously being at 21 and then 18, it had now been brought down to 16, meaning that people who were straight and people who were gay had the exact same laws regarding consent. Peter Tatchell, who we spoke about earlier, was a keen campaigner on this and is featured in this picture on the right. In 2019, the Justin Fashanu Foundation was established. Justin Fashanu was a footballer in the 80s and is one of the only football players to have come out during their career. The foundation was established many years after his death and has gone on to stamp out racism, homophobia and other such discriminations in football. The following is a timeline of events that have affected people who are trans and transgender. 1507 BC. Hatshepsut was an emperor in ancient Egypt almost 3,500 years ago, and some scholars argue that Hatshepsut had a non-conforming gender identity. Hatshepsut was assigned female at birth, however many depictions show Hatshepsut as wearing traditional clothes of a male ruler and referred to in some texts as the king of Egypt. 1728-1810, Chevalier d'Eon was a diplomat and a spy for Louis XV. They were also a fencer, and their portrait is in the National Portrait Gallery. The Beaumont Society is named after them and has been around since 1966, supporting trans and gender non-conforming individuals. 1915-1962, Michael Dillon, who was a physician and also a Navy officer. 1926-2020, Jan Morris, who wrote many books about her travels. She was born in 1926 and eventually in 1972 she went to Morocco to undergo gender reassignment surgery. She detailed her transition in her book Conundrum, which was one of the first autobiographies to discuss gender transition. 1945-1992, Marsha P. Johnson, a prominent civil rights activist and somebody who is rumoured to have started the Stonewall riots by throwing the first shot glass that resounded around the world. 1957, Sophie Wilson, a computer scientist for the BBC. 1960-2002, John Alexander Goodrum, who is a lawyer and an advocate for the LGBT community. 1987 to now, Elliot Page, who is an actor who has very recently come out as trans. Here are some events that have impacted and shown trans people to be visible across the world. In 576 AD, we have Anastasia the Patrician, who died and was later adopted by modern LGBT communities as a Christian transgender saint. In 1910, Magnus Hirschfeld published works on sexuality and gender, which were later burnt by Nazi supporters in 1933. This set back a lot of advancements with regard to social, sexual, and gender studies. 1951, Roberta Cowell was the first trans woman to receive gender affirmation surgery in the UK. In 1966, the Beaumont Society was founded to support trans and gender non-conforming people in the UK and still carries out some really good work today. 1969, the Stonewall Uprising happened, which was very important for trans visibility and trans lives, as well as lesbian, gay and bisexual lives. In 2004, the Gender Recognition Act allowed people to change their gender on their birth certificates. So here we're going to talk a little bit about visibility. An example of visibility here is Boy George, who was a singer in the band Culture Club. Now, it was really important for people who are lesbian, gay and bisexual to see Boy George and for Boy George to be visible, because Boy George's gender presentation sort of went outside of society's norms. And when people saw this, they saw that there was somebody who represented them. Young people who are LGBT find it really empowering to see themselves represented in the media. So what Boy George was doing, even though he wasn't out, helped people to feel a lot more confident in themselves. Boy George was the representation that lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and queer people had then, and the representation we have now could be the comedian Rosie Jones, or the TV personality Ryan Clark Neal, or Munro Bergdorf, who is a model and an activist. We've also got Amanda Steinberg, who's an actor, and Ollie Alexander, who is a singer and an actor. And we have Lee Pearson, the horse rider in the Paralympics. Given that you now know that LGBT people have always been there, what can you do to ensure that people, including yourselves, feel safe and celebrated for in their differences? Pause the video here and discuss as a group what things you might do. We hope you've enjoyed this session. Hopefully this will have helped you to think about the influence that LGBT people have had on history and everyday life. If you're on social media, we'd love to see your flag designs. You can tag us at Metro Charity on Instagram and Twitter, and you can find out more about us and our services at metrocharity.org.uk.